I tried to start streaming a little bit earlier and have it on blank on just a slide with no sound that can get up so we're up on time, everybody knows. So, but we are live now, so we got to start talking about football now. So, all right, let's turn to Luke 16, which is where we are, where we'll be picking up today. By the way, just so y'all know, the internet for whatever reason is not working and hasn't worked pretty much all week. I'm streaming off of my phone. Monday I've tried unplugging it, doing the whole reset, and it's not working. So I'll call them Monday so you can figure it out. For now, at least. So if you need the internet while we're here, then try to what? Sure. I can have my business associate. It's fine. Yeah. Well, it is not. It is now. That's good. Nobody needed to hear what I just said online, so we're all good. Let's have a word of prayer and then we'll get started. Our holy God, our Father in heaven, we're so thankful to you that you've given us this day and that you brought us here to study your word. Pray that it would be an encouragement to us, that we would grow closer to you, that we would have insight into your teachings, that we would allow the parables of Jesus to inform our own lives, to draw closer to you in holiness and righteousness and truth. We pray in your Son's name. Amen. All right. So we are in Luke chapter 16, having just gone through Luke 15. I think you've got customers, or you are. All right. Um, we were talking last week about the parables in Luke 15, which are focused in large part on seeking the lost, and not just seeking the lost, but valuing the lost. You know, the idea that these are people that are worth finding. They are worth going after. And Jesus shows that example, of course, in the lost sheep, in the lost coin, and ultimately in the lost son. And if we were, we kind of closed out on the parable of the lost sons. We didn't necessarily get through all of it, but if you were going to pick a main point and a main takeaway out of the lost son, what would you pick? I think you could probably make an argument for two and maybe even three, but which one, what would you say is the primary point Jesus is trying to make? Okay. Be willing to accept him back. Or okay. That that God is waiting and rejoices. And I think that's you can probably make that as a tie. I've mentioned this before that in general parables have one specific takeaway, but not always. And this one is a good example of probably maybe the exception that proves the rule. Because on the one hand, the message is essentially the same as it has been. We talked about the lost coin being a situation where you have a coin that has been lost, it has been misplaced. Whose fault is it? The owner, person owns the coin. They lost it, and it has value to them, and so they exert themselves and do whatever they can to go find that coin and get it back. And when they do, it's a cause of rejoicing. Now you got the lost sheep that wanders away. Now, why does the sheep wander away? Because it's what they do. You can say it, they're stupid. They just are. They're not very bright. They're not very alert. They just kind of wander. They're very smart in some ways, but they're very dumb in others. It's kind of like horses. They have very selective intelligence. But he wanders away. He's not trying to get lost. He just kind of he looks up at 1 minute, and all of a sudden everybody's gone. And so now it's not it's still the shepherd's fault because he's not supposed to allow that to happen. But because he wasn't paying attention, the sheep has gone off, and so now his desire is to go get him because he has a responsibility to that sheep. So there's an attitude towards the shepherd over the one that is lost. Now, if you were gonna let's tie all this together into the lost son. The temptation here is to say that if you look at the lost son, who is the shepherd? Who is the master? Who is the owner in the lost son? The father is, right? I think that's probably a pretty accurate way to say it. But if we tie it to what he's trying to say and who his primary audience really is here. I mean, he's not giving the prodigal son lesson to the sinners and the tax collectors, right? Who's he talking to? He's talking to the disciples, but more specifically, uh, I mean, who's he trying to not condemn, but who is he basically calling out in this parable? You got three choices, right? You got okay, they're the ones that are drawing near to him. They're the ones that are listening. But are they the ones that are necessarily the primary target of this? I mean, they know, they've repented, they're coming back. They understand that they need to come back, and they clearly believe that Jesus is calling them, and they believe that they have been welcomed back. They're not the ones whose minds need to be changed. Yeah, the Pharisees are the ones that have the bad attitude about this. They're the ones that don't understand why in the world you would go find a sheep that went off on its own without any, they don't deserve to come back. They made that choice. Or that coin that's it's just one of nine. It's really not that valuable to us. We're fine with what we have. Why do you need to be that diligent? And obviously, in the context of this, they're the ones that are saying, why is this sinner and tax collector worth going after in the first place? Now, let's tie this back. We talked about this last week. If you talk about who the shepherd is in Israel, who is responsible to make sure that the tax collector and the sinner didn't become tax collectors and sinners? The high priest, the elders, the leaders, the people that were entrusted with teaching the people. It was their job, and we see this in Jeremiah, we see this in Isaiah, we see this in Ezekiel. The shepherds of the flock of Israel were those who were tasked with leadership over the people, and they failed because they didn't lead them in the right way. They either led them into idolatry or they used them for their own selfish purposes, and in doing so set the example of ungodliness and unrighteousness that frankly the, the if the tax collector looks at the Pharisee who sees his role as a means of gaining more money and prestige, the tax collector says, well, I'm never going to be able to be that, but you know what I can do? The Romans are offering me an opportunity to go make a lot of money and be an important person by collecting taxes from my fellow man. Well, if I can't do it this way, the way the Pharisees are doing it, I'll go do it this way. It's the same essential temptation. They're just using a different path to it. And the Pharisees look at that and say, how dare they do that while we do this? And so the idea is that, first of all, in this, the idea is that God is welcoming as the Father to call them back and accepts them back, and He's rejoicing, and you ought to too. Because if you're the children of the Father, what is your desire? What do you want? What do you want to have happen above all? What are we supposed to? The Lord's Prayer. What do we pray for? Right. But even before that, what do we even? What's the first thing that we pray? All right. We honor our Father and say, "Hallowed be your name." And what's the next one? And your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. My desire before any of this is that God's will be done. And if I see that the Father is rejoicing about this, what should my attitude be? I ought to be rejoicing too, but I'm not. Why is the older brother not rejoicing? Well, it, yeah, 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 and that's a really important point too, because I think you're right. I didn't get the reward. He got a reward. Why don't I get a reward? Well, what was the son's reward? What is? Yeah, he has the inheritance, and the father tells him at the end of the story, "All that I have is thine. Everything I promised you, you're going to get." Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, they weren't grateful. They didn't use it properly. Now, and if you'll notice what he's saying is, look, I've always done what you told me to do. I've never disobeyed you. I've done this. I've done all the right things, except for the one thing that he should have been doing, which is looking out for his brother. He didn't care about his brother enough to, we talk about the father's influence. We don't really talk about the brother's influence and what role he would have played in all this and how he could have influenced his younger brother. Apparently, he didn't. But when his brother goes off the reservation, he gets angry about it. And to your point, there's a sense in which he's looking at this person and saying, this guy is horrible. Look at what he's done to you. Look at how he's abused and he does mention that. He talks about it down in This one son in verse 30, when this son of yours came who had devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him. There's a sense in which there's some self-righteousness here, in that he went off and did these horrible things. Yeah, this son of yours, he's not mine. He's your problem, not mine. This is not my responsibility. And look how he's taken advantage of you. And look what you've done for him. You've rewarded his unrighteousness by forgiving him. And you've never done anything for me for doing what was right. Which, again, as we said, are we really going to believe that this man never disobeyed his father ever, never did anything wrong? But his concern, as you say, is that why hasn't he done all these things for me, ignoring the fact that he's done everything for you. He's done all of these things. He's given you this position, and as you put it, and that's important because we're going to come back to it in a minute. He squandered what he had been given. Now, the younger brother squanders it by going and spending it and wasting it on riotous living. The older brother squanders it because he didn't appreciate what was given to him, and he didn't use it in the way that glorified his father. And so there's a sense in which Jesus kind of ties all that together and says, "Look, you don't realize that you're in the same situation that this man is in, but he sees it and you don't." Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and of course the problem was that they don't see themselves that way. Now, here's where we get into chapter 16. And what's interesting about that to me is that of course, I didn't put the animation, but that's fine. I don't want to cheat. I'm going to hold that off. Uh, I don't know that we always connect these two parables, but in chapter 16, Jesus launches right into a different parable here. He talks about the parable of, uh, it's usually called the unjust steward. The ESV calls it the unrighteous or dishonest manager. And I think that the idea of dishonest is probably a good way to interpret that. Now, let's read this, and then we'll come back and make some observations from this. I really believe this is becoming maybe my favorite parable, because there's a lot going on here, and it's tricky in some ways to understand what he's saying. But the more you look at it, the more you start to get out of it, I think, and the more connections you start to make with what he's been saying in this whole chapter. So he says in verse 1, he also said to his disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is it that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. The manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. He said to another, and how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. And the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into an eternal dwelling. So when you read that, is there anything about this parable that seems kind of unusual to you in terms of how Jesus typically tells parables? Like what? Who's the main character in the story? Let's start with there. Who's the main character? All right, we got the manager. We have three characters essentially. We've got the master who owns everything. We've got the manager who's in charge of everything, and then I'm just going to lump all the guests or the debtors together into one thing. So we've got the debtors as well. Clearly, the manager is the main point in this. The master comes to him, and what is the accusation against the master? I'm sorry, against the steward. He's wasting his money. He's squandering his money. Now, there's nothing in there that I think this is interesting. That the word there doesn't necessarily indicate dishonesty. or corruption or sinfulness or anything like that. It's just he wasted it. It's the same exact word that he used to describe the younger son and the prodigal son. Same word. And I don't think that's accidental. The, the younger son squandered his master's possessions on riotous living. This one squandered his master's possessions. We don't really know how. He may have been extorting. That wouldn't very, when you think about a master and a householder here or a steward, this is the same kind of idea that you would have had, for example, with Joseph back in the book of Genesis, when Joseph was named as the steward over the household of Potiphar. Basically, what does it say? Everything in his house was under his command. Potiphar, it says, didn't even need to know what was going on in the house because he trusted Joseph. That's kind of the idea. I don't even know, how much did you spend this week? I have no idea. Ask my steward over there. He handles the books. And that's not uncommon. It's a whole lot of trust, isn't it? And for someone who is dishonest, it's a pretty good way to make a living because I can do all kinds of things with that. Or maybe I'm just not very good at my job and I'm just not paying attention to it. I kind of just throw the money in there and turn off and let them go. And maybe I lent a whole bunch of money to people who can never pay it back, which sounds like may have happened. And all of a sudden the money's gone. And the master finally looks at his books and says, "Wait a second, you've been mishandling my house. You've messed up your stewardship. You're out." And so his response to that is what? What is his plan now? What's he going to do in response to this? Kind of. I guess in a sense it is. He, yeah, he cuts their bills in half. And you can make an argument that there's certainly, I don't know that he's really extorting, but he's very clearly expecting that if I do this for them, they'll do something good for me later on. Because why? He says I'm too proud to beg. I can't dig. I'm weak. Maybe you could argue he's lazy, which is very possible. That's not really the point. But the idea is that I can't handle myself based on the situation that is now arising, and so I got to have a plan to take care of myself. And so the idea is that I will make friends as Jesus describes it. In fact, that's kind of what he says later on. I'll make friends with these people that owe my master money so that after I'm kicked out of the street, they will remember that and they'll do good things for me. So yeah, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. We may not get to that today, but because there's a lot to talk about here. But so as we're thinking about the connections, I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. I'll just show you these because I've messed up my animation. The parable of the lost son and how these compare. Both of them wasted their resources that were given. They both reached an end where they realized that something had to change, and they both have an epiphany. Here's what I'm going to do. In the prodigal son, what does he say? Look, I'll go back. I'll humble myself before my father. I don't deserve anything from him, but I'm going to go and see what will he possibly do for me. That's kind of what happens with the steward as well. He says, you know what, I'm gonna slash these. He doesn't, as, to your point, he doesn't say now you owe me, but what he does is he does something good for them in the hopes that that will change their disposition towards him. They're hoping that their lot in life will be changed as a result of this. And when we think about this, how did their attitudes change towards what they had been given? When you think about the lost son, how does he start to view the things that his father had given him? Are they more important now? Yeah, they sure are now. Now that he's squandered them, now he doesn't have them, and I need to go back. And his idea is, I'm going to go back, and even if he just lets me eat with his servants, that's enough for me. Now you got the unjust steward, and this is an interesting question, and I've thought about this a lot. If you were going to make a parallel, what is his stewardship? Uh, First of all, who is the unjust steward that's being described here? Do you have an idea on that? Who do you think Jesus is talking about here? Yeah, I think so. Who is it that's been given trust over God's household? The leaders of God's people, the Pharisees, the scribes. And what had they done? They've squandered it. There's two ways you can look at that. And I think it folds into what he's talked about back in chapter 14 and what he's going to talk about again in chapter 16. There's two senses in which the leaders of Israel had been given stewardship. What, what would you say those are? We've already alluded to one of them. Okay, well, yeah, okay, that's three. They've been good stewardship of the law. It's their responsibility to teach and to guide the people, which leads us into another aspect of stewardship. Who were they responsible for? Yeah, they were responsible for the people. The people were their steward. Israel was their stewardship. The temple, yeah, that's true. Uh, I'm not thinking about that so much, but yeah, that's a good point. That was given to their stewardship. The other one I would say is the fact that when you think about the Pharisees, how would you describe their financial situation? Rich, poor, middle class? They're typically rich, right? They had been blessed a lot. They had all kinds. They were certainly better off than all these other people. Yeah, in a lot of ways. That's probably there's a lot of truth to that. So they've been given the stewardship over God's people, and they have been given abundant blessings financially to oversee, to use properly in a godly way, kind of like we are today. Same idea. There's a stewardship they've been given, and what Jesus is saying is that you wasted that stewardship. And so now he says this steward comes to an idea. Maybe I need to do a better job. Maybe I need to find a way to use the authority and the position I've been given to ensure my well-being later on. And so as you think about that, what's the difference, by the way, in that between the unjust steward and the prodigal son? What does the prodigal son have that the unjust steward does not have? He has home to go to. He has a father that loves him. Now he doesn't know how that's going to play off, but at least he's got a father that has some sort of responsibility. What responsibility does the master have to the house to the steward? None. I can throw him in. If I can show he's been criminally wrong, I can throw him in jail. I can just kick him out on the street. I can do whatever I want. I have no obligation to do anything for him at all. And you could also make the argument that the debtors to whom he is going and helping, do they have an obligation to him? Well, to pay the debt, yeah, they gotta pay the debt. I don't have to pay this guy anything though. I have no obligation to him whatsoever. And even if he does this favor for me, there's a good chance that the reason that they are so heavily in debt is because the steward has cheated them. There's something that they used to do. Uh, I didn't put this into my notes. I have to remember it. But if you remember, what was the law about of the law of Moses concerning how they could lend money or should not lend money to their fellow Israelites? Do you remember what the restrictions were? Couldn't charge interest. It was against the law. Now they were doing it and they were condemned for it. But the Pharisees and apparently a lot of the people in Israel had come across a really ingenious way of doing this. And what they would do, rather than loan you money, I'm going to loan you grain or I'm going to loan you oil. The going market rate for grain is, let's just say it's $20 a bag. I'm going to price this at $45 a bag. Why? That's my interest. I'm going to loan you this in money. So I'm not charging you interest. I'm just overcharging you for what you from what you borrowed from me. So now I can charge you interest without really charging you interest. There's a lot of supposition about people from people in reading this parable that that's the dishonesty that's been going on and called for. And maybe that's true, but it was pretty common practice in that day. And so it was a real easy way to make even more and more money off these people and exploit them, which is very likely what the steward was doing. So he does this. Uh, he finds a way to say, all right, they don't, maybe I overcharge them, but if I cut that off, maybe they'll look more favorably at me. Maybe I cut their bill in half. Maybe they'll be, and I think we want to make sure. I've heard people say, see, the man has an epiphany here. He decides to do what's right. He cuts off the money that he had illegally charged him. I don't think that's what's going on. How does Jesus describe this man? When he at the very end of this parable, um, In verse 8, how does he describe the man? He calls him what? He calls him dishonest. Now, I mentioned earlier, he's not called dishonest at the beginning of this parable. He's just wasteful. But now he's called dishonest. And I don't know if it seems to me that the point Jesus may be making is essentially that what he did was not honest. A lot of times we'll go to this parable, and one of the reasons it's hard to understand is it really seems like Jesus is kind of rewarding this guy for doing something that he probably shouldn't have done. That Jesus is praising this guy and saying, "See, be like that guy." That's one of the things that's very different about this parable than other parables, because when Jesus tells a parable, is the main character always a good guy? No, we got plenty of examples of that. But what always happens to the bad guy at the end? He, he gets his yeah, he gets what he deserves. We just saw that in Luke 15. We're going to see it again in Luke 16 here in the next section. But it- there's never an example where somebody does something wrong and it seems like he comes out on top, and he even seems to get praised for it. And that seems like an odd thing for us. Um, but notice what Jesus says as he sums up this. He says in verse 8, the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. What's the observation here? All right. First of all, who does the master represent in this? Does the master represent anybody in this particular parable? We talked about this a while back, and it's a good example why it seems like it's when we talk about the difference between an analogy and a parable, it seems like kind of a useless. I mean, it just seems like kind of more of an academic thing. But this is an important thing. Does the master here have to represent anything or anybody specifically? No, he's just telling a story. What happens is we'll look at this, and well, the master in this parable, usually the master in Jesus' parables is who? It's God. Well, so if the master here represents God, then that must mean that God is pleased with what he's doing. And so does that mean then that we should be using our money to buy friends and influence people and do that, and that somehow that will get me into heaven? Well, no, the analogy completely breaks down there. But that's not what he's doing here. He's telling a story that says that the master praised this man. And why did he praise him? Because he did what was right? Because he was shrewd. It reminds me a little bit. I was thinking about this, what the good comparison would be. All right, yeah. So last night, in the Texas Georgia game, Texas gets a defensive stop. It's fourth down. Their backup quarterback or their backup punters or their punters hurt. They go out to punt, and man, it's looking good. We got this thing. And Georgia runs a fake punt and gets the first down. I'm not happy about that at all. But I got to say that was good play. That was well done. I think that's what kind of what we're seeing here, because when this master sees this action, he can't help but say, that was a smart move. And I probably would have done that if I were in his position. Why? Because the master's a righteous person? No. Because the master thinks exactly like the unrighteous steward. What's he concerned about? Money. I want money. I want as much money as I can have. I'm mad at you because you wasted my money, not because you did anything wrong, but because you wasted my money. And so now he looks at it and says, well, that's I got to hand it to him. That was pretty smart. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Maybe. Yeah. Yeah. It gets back to the idea that I think that we could very easily go down a trail until we remind ourselves that's not really the point Jesus is trying to make. And so, what is the point Jesus is trying to make? He says, this man, all right, the master, who is a worldly man, looks at this other worldly man and says, you know what? That was pretty smart. And so, what does Jesus say then? I tell you in verse 9, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. Now, that's where it gets tricky. What does he mean by that? When we think about unrighteous wealth, Uh, Money gained unrighteously. There's some people that will argue, and I'm kind of on the fence on this. When typically, when Jesus talks about money, in fact, he's going to say it later on in this passage, down in verse. If you go down, in fact, let's read verse 10 through 13. This is a good point, a good way of showing how the context of the story is going to tell you a lot about what Jesus is trying to say. He says in verse 10, one who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? If you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you at that of that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one, love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Typically, in verse 13, is he saying that money is bad? No, that's not his point. But he is saying you can't serve God and money. Money can't be your focus if you want to serve God. It can't come first. And I think that when he talks about unrighteous money, I think it's most likely that he's not saying that the money is inherently unrighteous, but it is unrighteous compared to the greater spiritual things that you ought to be focused on. Yeah, I think that's probably the point. Now, he might actually be making a specific point about the Pharisees and saying, look, we all know you're rich and we all know how you got that money too. And it wasn't because of your righteousness. You got it because of your unrighteousness. Now, the question is, what are you going to do with it now that you have it? You could double down on that and see yourself and elevate yourself and make yourself better than everybody else and continue to oppress and continue to look down on these people and continue to say they're not worthy of the kingdom of heaven. Or, well, we don't talk about Zacchaeus, but Zacchaeus, we can do what Zacchaeus did, which is what? How did Zacchaeus use his money after he repented? Okay, he brought him in and through a feast, which, by the way, the Pharisees kind of did earlier, but they didn't do it to glorify God. They did it to trap Jesus. But what else did Lazarus say, having repented and having acknowledged? Oh, sorry, Zacchaeus. What else did Zacchaeus say about his money, having repented? Yeah. If I've defrauded anybody, and I don't think that was a hypothetical, it probably didn't happen, but just in case, I think he's saying the ones that I've defrauded, I will give back fourfold. That kind of sounds a little bit like what's going on here, doesn't it? Now, again, I don't think the motivation is the same. But Jesus seems to be making a point that you have been given these riches. You have, whether it be the stewardship of the people, whether it be the stewardship of your wealth, whatever it might be, and you're going to be called into account for it. Kind of like the man who had the bigger barns, who built the bigger barns because he didn't have room for all his wheat. You're going to be held accountable for this. Now, what are you going to do? You're in a situation, you got a whole lot of money here, and they can't get you into heaven. But what you could do is start using those things in a more godly manner, in a way that is beneficial to others, starting to see the people that you have been entrusted as more than just resources to be mined and exploited, but rather when Jesus talks about how my actions towards another can be valuable to me, and he tells them, for anyone who gives one of the least of these little ones a cup of cold water in my name because he is a disciple, he shall not lose his reward. Is there benefit to me in helping brother in Christ? Absolutely, there is. That is a means of gain. It's not a mean of financial gain, but it's a means of spiritual gain. And there's the idea here that if you would look at these people that you have rejected as a means of spiritual gain, as a means of pleasing God and doing what God has called, you can bless these people, and in doing so, God will bless you. Not from the standpoint of the health and wealth thing, but the and not from the standpoint of earning your financial reward, but from the standpoint of saying, look, God, I value my stewardship. I'm going to do what you want me to do. I'm going to help these people that have need of help, acknowledging that the things that I have are not mine. And I think that's a key point. Because if you'll notice in verse 14, What's the response of the Pharisees to all this? The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things and they ridiculed him. Clearly, they understood who he was talking about. And clearly, they understood that no matter, there's a lot of different ideas that we can come out of this, but what they seem to be taking out of this is he actually thinks that our money is better used in other ways than we're using it right now. He thinks that we're misusing our money. He thinks that we're unwise stewards. How dare he? And they mocked him. Why? Because look at my money. I'm doing real well. You say I'm misusing my money, and yet God continues to give me this blessing. Now, how am I getting this blessing? Very likely because I'm exploiting the people around me. I'm not getting it because I'm doing it the way God wants me to do it. I'm getting it based on my own cunning and my own desire. And they're saying, look, God's giving me all this money. That must mean he approves. That must mean we're okay. And so they laughed at him. And that brings us into the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And we'll talk about the rich man and Lazarus next week because we're about out of time. But you see how all this starts to fit together in this context, in this idea of stewardship and using your finances and valuing what God has given you and the opportunity that you've been given to use those funds in service to those that are also in the kingdom. Uh, and that all leads us up to the rich man and Lazarus and what happens when the bill comes due, if you will. So, any comments or thoughts, questions on this that we want to talk about? Yeah, yeah, hmm yeah, absolutely. Abs- hmm Yep. Yeah. And I want to make this one point real quick too, because you that reminded me of something I did want to say, is that because his point is that um, sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And the idea, to your point, they got all kinds of inventive ways to increase their portfolio. Would that we were that creative in figuring out a way to lay up treasures in heaven. Do we do that? Do we sit around and think about all this? And I'm thinking about me. How much time do I spend thinking to myself, how could I please God better today? How could I use what God has given me today to do something good for the kingdom of heaven? Do I spend as much time on that as I do thinking about how I could grow my 401k? I think that's where this lesson starts to hit home a little bit for me at least, and probably for all of us to some degree. Any large yes, something. Any other comments or thoughts? All right. Well, thank you very much for your participation. We will pick up. We may have a little bit more to say about this, and then we'll move into the rich man and Lazarus next Sunday. Thank you so much.